welcome back to Biomes. This time we are talking about Chernobyl. Yes, we are talking about the Chernobyl of the nuclear disaster, but we're not actually talking about the disaster and meltdown itself. We're kind of talking about the, aftermath of that and the local area around it. Chernobyl is located in Ukraine and is smack in the middle of the exclusion zone, a 2,600 square kilometer area that you are not allowed to go into due to a lot of radiation. Now, part of the exclusion zone includes the Red Forest, a former pine forest named for the fact that after the explosion at Chernobyl, pretty much all of the pine trees located in that forest died and turned this kind of brownish red color. Now, the Chernobyl disaster did have quite the impact on the native plants and animals, as well as, of course, the people that worked at the plant and lived in the area. A lot of radiation is definitely not a great thing to happen, but despite that, the area around Chernobyl is actually considered to be now a wildlife refuge. Since people rarely enter the exclusion zone, there is very little human interference in the area as of right now, and so it has become a great place for animals and plants to thrive, surprisingly, despite the wicked amounts of radiation still present in the area. Now, like I said, a lot of the pine forest did die due to that initial explosion and radiation. However, it is bouncing back, with namely the Scots pine being the main pine tree in the area. Other trees include things like the silver birch, which took over after the initial explosion killed off the most of the pine trees, and is the other main tree species found. Other plants include grasses like this one, the winter rye, as well as things like white clovers, and other flowering plants like this one, the common columbine. Now, like I said before, the initial explosion did cause deaths of a lot of the local plant life, but it is bouncing back quite nicely, and while not fully healthy, they are still being impacted by radiation. A lot of the life there is experiencing the effects of radiation, and a lot of the exclusion zone plants, like the clover and the columbine, are being studied to observe the effects of radiation on plant genomes. Plants aren't the only things that are surprisingly thriving in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Other animals include things like deer, like roe deer, as well as moose. Even very large animals like the European bison are thriving in the exclusion zone because of the fact that there's very little human interaction there. They can thrive in essentially their own private game park. It even is one of the last few places where the last true wild horse, the Przewalski's horse, lives freely. I've talked about the Przewalski's horse in an endangered species spotlight before, but the Chernobyl exclusion zone is one of the few places where it has a somewhat decent population of this wild horse, which is super cool. There's also a whole lot of wild boars found there, which are weirdly radioactive, apparently, like even more so than would be expected from them living in a radioactive area. Other animals that have made their way mostly actually back to the exclusion zone include things like Eurasian black bears. Now, I say returned to because while Chernobyl and the neighboring towns were active, a lot of the native wildlife was driven out of the area, but has since made its return. This also includes things like European wolves, which again were driven out of the area up until a bit after the disaster when they returned to live freely. This also includes things like the Eurasian lynx and the European badger, as well as animals like foxes, minks, and stoats and martens. There's also quite a high level of bird species found there as well, such as the black grouse, small songbirds such as the hawfinch, and the great tit, as well as guys like this one, the pied flycatcher, and the barn swallow, which actually is one of the few bird species to show a markedly negative effect from living in the exclusion zone, with their pigmentation actually being altered. And this isn't to say that all of these animals and plants are thriving in the exclusion zone free of any negative impact. In fact, there are quite a few mutations seen, such as a much increased rate of albinism, especially in birds, as well as overall an increased number of birth defects and cancers that would otherwise not be as common in the wild, as well as some things such as many insects having a shorter lifespan than normal. However, there still is a decent trade-off for being largely undisturbed by human activity, which in areas like Europe is quite rare. So while all of these radiation factors do have some sort of impact, there is also the benefits of them just living on their own. Now, there are also a couple types of reptiles and amphibians, including couple types of snakes and frogs like this one, the oriental tree frog. And of course, finally, no video about Chernobyl would be complete without mentioning our friend, the radiation-eating fungus that has been discovered inside the Chernobyl power plant itself and thrives off of metabolizing radiation. Now, you can actually go to Chernobyl. There are officially some tours, and people do go there on their own, which is not recommended. Don't do that. But you can join an official tour and be taken through the safer areas of the exclusion zone, which is pretty cool. And what I personally find especially interesting is that out of everything that came out of this definitely horrible disaster was the unintended effect of a pretty good wildlife sanctuary and a fascinating opportunity to study the effects of high level of radiation on the local flora and fauna. Would it have been better if this didn't happen, if the whole Chernobyl explosion and disaster didn't happen? Obviously, of course, but since it did, might as well use it as an opportunity for research that otherwise might have not have happened.